Welcome to Oneida County History Center. I'm Rebecca McLean, the Executive Director, and I'd like to thank you all for being here on this cold winter day, which will hopefully be the last one. Today we have two wonderful historians who we know very well here at the History Center, Mary Hayes Gordon and Deirdre Sinnott, who are going to share their new research on the crucial and unheralded role of Oneida County's women in the movement for abolition and the Underground Railroad. I'm going to invite our presenters to come up and start their lecture.
Thank you. Wow, a lot of people came out. I'm assuming you ran from your house straight to the car, got in and ran inside. Happy International Women's Day. It's today. And as it's been said, we're going to talk about the women's role in this decades-long movement against enslavement. After this short opening, I'm going to turn it over to Mary, who's going to talk about some individuals and some of the context, and just a language warning. We might be reading from some historical documents where the language is, let's say, outdated, but you know, we can't discuss the Underground Railroad without talking about those who were enslaved and who ran or who helped another person run while remaining enslaved. It might be a woman who urged her children to leave so that they could have a chance at freedom. All of those people are part of the Underground Railroad. They are the beginning, middle, and end, and the heart and soul of it. Like in this advertisement, you see 50-year-old Helen. She's described as a little bit lame, and she carried 2 bundles of clothes with her. Norms and social customs were different back then for women in the early mid to 1800s. But in 1837, the Boston Female Slavery Society had its annual meeting. And in it, they addressed this question of promiscuous assemblies. First, they quote a sermon by Mr. Winslow, where he defines the term generally as a meeting or assembly of men and women together that's not a service in the church. Turns out you're all at a promiscuous assembly right now. And I'm looking at you, and I'm thinking that you go to a lot of these promiscuous assemblies. According to Winslow, the apostle teaches us that here in church, women must not only be in silence, but must even have on them then the customary badge of modesty and subjugation. It was frowned upon for women to assume the place of public teachers, to form societies, to travel about from place to place as lecturers and guides to public sentiment, to assemble in conventions and discuss political questions, to pass resolutions, to make speeches, and vote upon civil, political, moral, or religious matters. They weren't supposed to send their names up to gentlemen in official stations, in other words, signing a petition. You weren't supposed to do that, or attempt the reformation of morals by engaging in free conversation. Now, beginning around 1810, women started coming out of their designated spheres here in Utica and formed charitable and benevolent societies. Here are some of the earliest in Oneida County. And much of this work in these societies was done by women, for women, including doing the fundraising to support them, and they went on to do big things like form the Utica Orphan Asylum and other things that are really large and took a lot of management over time. They also helped organize religious revivals. It was claimed that there was a danger of women assuming the place and attitude of men as public reformers and itinerant lecturers. The men were triggered by the women taking political action to support the controversial cause of abolishing enslavement. While some men were no doubt disturbed by the activities, they were not as outraged until women started talking about abolishing slavery. And the result of talking about immediate emancipation could bring about social scorn persecution, attacks by anti-abolition mobs. It was believed at the time that those who encounter mob violence by advancing truths against the possible popular opinion are guilty of that violence. So whatever you say, if somebody gets mad at you for their own reasons, it's really your fault for saying it. And there were differences, of course, this is the United States. There were differences in what black women and white women, what their experience was, what they were expected to be doing. In Utica, there was a number, in the early part, this is from 1836, there was a number of places where the black community congregated. Aha! Okay, Hope Street and Johnson Street up here, that was one black community. And then along the Erie Canal, because there was a lot of work there, that was one of the main employers of black men. And then, of course, a lot of people have heard about Post Street. That was a very important place for the black community. You know, things were just not the same. For example, what jobs were open to each race? Women of color did not have the same financial independence that richer white women had. Okay, so this is a little Excel sheet that I put together with my shaky hand filming it. But over there on the far side are all the different jobs listed for the 1860 census in Utica's 4th Ward. And each person recorded what they did. And I paid special attention and took a whole list down of what the jobs available were, profession, occupation, or trade. It showed 134 different possible jobs. Of that vast majority, most of them went to white men. White women were only able to find employment in 8 possible trades: dressmaker, housekeeper, nurse, seamstress, servant, tailoress, teacher, washerwoman. For black women, the path to employment was even narrower, with only 4 possibilities: cook, dressmaker, servant, or washerwoman. African American men were excluded from most of those 134 jobs. They were mostly only able to work as barbers, boatmen, cooks, electrician. That was one guy. I don't know exactly what he was doing, but farmers, laborers, navigators, peddlers, porters, printers, servants, waiters, and whitewashers. To quote an abolitionist newspaper in Utica at the time, colored people are excluded from most of our colleges and academies, from our trades and professions, and from the inside of our steamboats and stagecoaches. They are put into the corner of our churches and are seldom permitted to sit either at the Lord's table or any other with the whites. The result of organizing into these benevolent societies was that white women had a chance to leave the domestic sphere and engage in the world around them. The next thing was to change things that they saw as evils. One of the outlets for their organizing was to join the increasing movement of resistance and denunciation of enslavement. Okay, so hopefully you're all warmed up. Mary's going to talk about the efforts of particular women, individuals, and then I'm going to come back with even more individuals, and then we'll wrap it up. So, Mary Haysbord.
Well, hello everybody. It's great to see you all here. So I'm going to give a little context to some of the things we're going to be talking about. And an important part of this story is where the European Americans came from who settled in this area. Many of them came from Western New England, okay, which some of you probably know was the scene of 2 great awakenings. We're going to be talking a little bit about how this area was ripe for this type of thing to happen. The European Americans who moved into this area, many of them came from Western New England. which had had a fervor of religious and evangelicalism, okay? So it was a move from the Calvinistic idea of predestination to the idea of a more personal and active path to God and salvation. Okay. So there were many names, some of them you will know. Jonathan Edwards, the first in Connecticut, very famous evangelical preacher in the Great Awakening. And his son, Jonathan Edwards II, actually came here and established the first 3 religious societies in this area. So very strong influence of the evangelicals from Western New England. Okay. One of the very famous and active and influential local preachers in this second Great Awakening was a man named Charles Grandison Finney. He grew up here, he preached all over, very, very influential in getting people to understand or want to have a more personal path to God, okay? One of the ways this was done was through revivals, right, through this movement. I put this slide up, and if you can see it, I hope you can see it, I'd like for you to notice all the women in this. This is a stock photo painting of a revival. All throughout here. They're in the front, they're mixed in throughout. So they were taking part in this revival movement as well, and was an offspring for them, a springboard for them into other reform movements. Abolition we're talking about here. Utopian communities, many of us in this area understand utopian communities with the Oneida Mansion House nearby. Temperance, women's suffrage. Abolition work by women was a springboard into the suffrage movement as well. Sunday school movement and literacy. Literacy was extremely important. So one of the ways that their religious belief was manifested was by action, by doing things. There is, in the first edition of The Friend of Man, which was the New York State anti-slavery newspaper, I'm going to read you this quote. "We believe that all men are free moral agents because God, the Bible, and their consciences hold them responsible for their actions, because their Creator has placed them under moral law and because He prohibits every invasion of their rights." In the book of James, chapter 1, verses 21 to 22, in the King James Version of the Bible, it says, "Lay apart all filthiness and superfluity of naughtiness, and receive with meekness the engrafted word, which is able to save your souls. Be ye doers of the word, and not hearers only, deceiving your own self." The women in this county and who came through this county were doers of the word. They were putting their actions. So here are some of the ways that they did these things, that they got things to happen in the abolition movement. Now remember, Deirdre talked about their sphere, where women could be, where they could not be, what they were and were not supposed to do. They formed female anti-slavery societies. They were not supposed to form societies. They sent petitions to Washington, another thing that those promiscuous assemblies were not supposed to do. They attended anti-slavery conventions. And I love this one too, because this we still do today. They attended and created fairs, craft fairs, to sell crafts, baked goods, etc., to raise money for abolitionist work. We are still holding bake sales to raise money for the things that we support. They gave their own money, they learned to lecture, they hosted, they were writers, they took many, many things and pulled them together to do this work. So I'm going to start with a local family called the Wills family. The two women of this family were Sarah and Frances Wills. They were on a farm in New Hartford. The drawing was done by R.C. Oster, David Oster, a local artist, years ago, as a rendition of what the home would have looked like in the 1800s. And next to it, you see a picture from 2012 which is what the home still looks like today. Now, granted, it's been enlarged. There's parts of it you can't see, but the first structure is still there. So I like to talk about Sarah and Frances because they kind of exemplify many of the ways women supported this cause, but did not get the recognition. Okay. Now this family has been here. The deed for their farm goes back to 1817, this African-American family here in New Hartford. But we know that they've been here, the Wills family, since at least 1800, because Sampson Wills was buying property in a pew in the New Hartford church in 1805 and 1800. So they sheltered freedom seekers in their home, which was a very dangerous activity at that time. We really can learn about what women were doing when we look at what the males they were surrounded with and related to were doing. So Frances, born about 1798, died 1850. Her husband Richard, who died 1840, he was the original owner of this farm. Okay. Sarah, born in 1832, I can't find her death date yet. Her husband Charles was the nephew of Richard. He inherited this house. So this family had this home from 1817 to 1865. Signed anti-slavery petitions. They supported the anti-slavery publications, including The Friend of Man. We have a very strong oral history that is well supported by the facts of their life and of the times to say they were a stop on the Underground Railroad. Other males in the family were very active in the Negro Convention movement, which was another way that they were fighting against enslavement. So I like to talk about them because, like I said, to me, they kind of are examples of the things women did in their day-to-day lives to support this that they get no recognition for. Now, they're in New Hartford. We're going to go up to the northern part of the county with the Everett women. We've got the two Elizabeths. The mother, Elizabeth Everett, she was married to the very well-known and active anti-slavery preacher Robert Everett up in Remsen, of Welsh descent. They moved here from Wales. It's a very strong anti-slavery household. They had speakers in their church. They were known to shelter freedom seekers. Her husband published anti-slavery newspapers in Welsh and also published Uncle Tom's Cabin in Welsh. But he couldn't have done all of that without her support. And one of the ways that she supported these endeavors was financially. She had an inheritance at that time about 6,000 pounds, which could be almost close to $1 million in today's money. We've done several different calculations, Jan and I, on this. But her money supported these publishing endeavors and the other things that they were doing. And they had a very strong anti-slavery household. And one of their daughters, Elizabeth Everett Butler, she was a student at a place in Clinton I'm going to talk about in a minute called the Young Ladies Domestic Seminary. She was an assistant pupil when she was there, kind of like head girl. And then she became a teacher there after she graduated, when it was with Mr. Kellogg, who started it, we'll talk about it in a minute, and when it became the School of the Free Baptist. And the last 3 years she was there, she was the principal of the school, the female side of the school. So she attended the Young Ladies Domestic Seminary in Clinton, which is a place that had a profound effect on, really, the world. Right? So it was established in 1833 by a man named Hiram Kellogg. And I'm not even reading my notes now, so I'll catch up. It was a multi-class manual labor school, much like the Oneida Institute was over in Whitesboro for men, which meant not only could women work to help offset some of their tuition, but at this school, all of the women worked there to take care of the place. They cooked, they cleaned, they mended, everyone worked. So you wouldn't, it didn't matter if you were, paying your full tuition or if you were a scholarship student, everyone worked together to make the place work. I don't know if you can see any of the course of study here. Hold on. Let me bring it over here. Okay, so they studied history, geometry, astronomy, philosophy. Hold on a second. Physics and more. But it was a school designed to educate women and send them out into the world, and they did. And about 1838 is when they started having African American students come to the school. Okay, so I'm going to talk about just a couple of them and a few things that they did. So I have Joanna Turpin here. You can see her picture. She and her husband, Edwin Frederick Howard, she was Turpin Howard, they were prominent African-American abolitionists who lived in a free black neighborhood in Boston. I like her too, because she's kind of almost like an elevated Frances Wills or Sarah Wills, okay? She was born in New Rochelle, came up to study at the seminary, as did her sister. After she graduated and she married, she was a stay-at-home mother, an anti-slavery activist, and a strong proponent of education. One of the things that she did in Boston was she and her husband hosted the traveling speakers, Frederick Douglass, to people who would come. Now remember, there wasn't a grand hotel where Frederick Douglass could go stay. So when these speakers and anti-slavery agents were moving around, they had to be housed as well. They had to be housed, they had to be fed. And I like this quote, the Boston Athenaeum says this about Joanne and women like her. It says, "Black women activists who fought subversively and persistently with tact, class, and cleverness to rectify the propagation of slavery." You see a picture in the middle here of the building, the Young Ladies Domestic Seminary. That's what it looks like now. It was larger then. Some of the extra parts have come down, but it's a private family residence now. It's still here in Clinton, New York. And we have over here Elizabeth Smith Miller from Peterborough. Her father was Garrett Smith. Her mother was Anna Fitzhugh Smith. And she also came over to the Young Ladies Domestic Seminary to study and work. She invented the bloomers that were made popular. I always love that about her. I think that's a nice little thing to know about her. Okay, all right, I'm gonna tell you about Mary Miles, all right? This is not a picture of Mary Miles, just so you know. This is a picture of a woman named Prudence Crandall. And I'm gonna go to my notes because I wanna make sure I get this to you. So, Mary Miles was a student at Prudence Crandall's Canterbury Female Boarding School for young ladies of color. It was in Canterbury, Connecticut. Okay? She had to flee, and I'm using that word deliberately, in September of 1834 with 20 other African American females after facing harassment, violence from the people in the town. Prudence Crandall had to close her school because the town passed a black law which said you cannot educate people of color who come from any other state. And most of her students came from New York, Pennsylvania, and Rhode Island. While Mary Miles, she was an African American student at Prudence Crandall School, while she was there, she became friends with a teacher named Samuel J. May. Samuel May became very prominent in the abolition movement and became wealthy, and he pulled together a collection of print material right after the Civil War. It is an amazing collection. He told people, he wrote his friends and spread the word, send me your stuff, your pamphlets, your newspaper, etc. I use that as a place where I do a lot of research, and Cornell, it's held at Cornell, has digitized that entire collection. So if you're doing this type of research, it's a great place to go and get information. So Mary Miles ended up coming to the Young Ladies Domestic Seminary in Clinton. She finished there, and she went in 1841, and she opened a school in New York City. She later went to what is called a normal school in Lexington, Mass., where Samuel J. May led that school. She graduated there in 1843 as the first African-American woman in the U.S. to graduate from a public normal school. A normal school was a school that taught teachers. Right? She taught in Albany, and she taught in Cincinnati. Then she married a man named Henry Bibb. He was a self-emancipated slave. In 1850, after the Fugitive Slave Act, they moved to Canada. Okay, so all this time she's been teaching, she's been supporting the causes. They started a newspaper up there. The first black newspaper in Canada was called The Voice of the Fugitive. That's the masthead I have here. Okay. Their house was a final stop on the Underground Railroad. And when freedom seekers would make it to Canada, they would take them in and help get them set up. She continued to teach there and opened a school for blacks. And when that closed due to finances, she opened 2 different schools that were multiracial. So she moved back here after the death of her husband. But when you think about this woman who wanted an education and believed in education and abolition so strongly, she put up with violence and harassment, had to flee from state to state, came and went to another school, started schools, taught, started a newspaper with her husband. I mean, that's an amazing trajectory for a poor black woman in 1838. So I get a little excited over Mary Miles. One more who has a connection here to the Young Ladies Domestic Seminary is a woman named Louisa Jacobs. Now, Louisa Jacobs was enslaved. Her mother wrote the book some of you may be familiar with called Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. Her mother, Harriet Jacobs, she's the seated picture here, lived 7 years in, it's not even an attic, it was the roof of a house with a floor when she was trying to escape slavery. She ultimately did, she wrote that book. Her daughter, Louisa, and Louisa's brother were able to come north later. Louisa went to the Young Ladies Domestic Seminary, but her father was a white man in the South who had enslaved her. He bought her, and knowing it was his child, he bought her, let her move north, never emancipated her or her brother. So she lived until the Civil War as an enslaved woman to her father and did amazing things. Last one for right now, and then I'll let you go. Really, this is a really cool person. So Matilda Miner grew up in Brookfield. She was born in Brookfield. She lived in Oneida County, taught here, and this is her trajectory. She went to the Young Ladies Domestic Seminary. In 1851, she opened a school for colored girls in an apartment in Washington, D.C. And slavery was still legal there. Okay? In 1858, with money from Harriet Beecher Stowe, she bought 3 acres for a school. In 1861, she moved to California for her health. The school closed for a couple of years. She came back in 63, reopened it as the Institute for the Education of Colored Youth, and it became associated with Howard University. 1879, the school became the minor normal school, part of the DC school system. In 1929, it became Miners Teachers College. In 1955, it merged with the Wilson's Teachers College to become the District of Columbia's Teachers College. In 1975, The college consolidated to become the University of the District of Columbia, which is an HBCU, a historically black college or university. All from the work of this woman from here in Oneida County. So that's my first bit. Deirdre's going to come back up with a little bit more for you, and then I'll be back later.
Yeah, that was great. I think we were both surprising each other with how much we have. Okay, so what we have here is Cynthia DeLong and James DeLong. No pictures of them, but they were heavily involved in the Underground Railroad. They kept their house unlocked at night, and it was common that they would find people who were escaping from enslavement on the floor of the kitchen when they got up in the morning. Cynthia would have been cooking and making accommodations for the people who found their way to the house. While all this was going on, she gave birth to 7 children, 4 who lived to adulthood. James C. DeLong's obituary said that he was a regular and active conductor on the Underground Railroad and pressed his family into the same service. All of his children helped him with this work. Some of the freedom seekers who reached the Utica station were sent west to Syracuse, onto Rochester, and thence across the lake, while others were afraid to go on the railroad. They struck across north and were aided to Watertown. They would have had to walk the whole way to the Canadian line. Someone told the newspaper that once 21 refugees turned up in Utica at one time, and they were asking about where's John DeLong's house, and they were sent there, and the next morning he went to church, and he brought all of them with him to church. And he was very happy about that. In the DeLong house, there was a library for the Utica Female Anti-Slavery Society, and meetings were held there. James and Cynthia were deeply involved in the campaign to have the Methodist clergy denounce pastors who were slaveholders in the South, and that led to a rending of the Methodist Church. I should follow that up more so I know what the outcome was. But I know there was trouble and that slavery was the cause of it. Across from these are some petitions. That's Cynthia DeLong's name, first name on the petition. And here she is signing up the petition that's going to go. And apparently there's 853 people who signed it. We don't have all the pages, but that was one of the petitions that she sent. And this was against the Fugitive Slave Law of 1795. Almost across from John Street, there lived another couple who were apparently involved in the Underground Railroad. One of the women who married one of the DeLong kids told a story in the newspaper. It said that at the time Miss Susan B. Anthony visited here in the 1850s, the DeLongs, Mrs. DeLong, who was a daughter of Cynthia and James, I was a young girl, perhaps 16 or 17. My parents, Mr. and Mrs. Ezra Thompson, lived at what was 110 John Street. Our home was a depot on the Underground Railroad for freedom for the slaves. On one occasion, Susan B. Anthony made a visit to Utica, and she was going to do an address at the old Mechanics Hall on the subject of anti-slavery, but they wouldn't open the doors for her. And there was a mob outside, and they started, being abusive, and they started throwing things at Susan B. Anthony. And the mayor was down there, and he tried to protect her with his umbrella from all the eggs and the produce or whatever, ancient eggs. He escorted her back to the Thompson home on John Street. And in the parlor, a few people met. So they couldn't stop the meeting, but they did stop the meeting, but they couldn't stop the meeting. At the first ever national gathering of the Female Anti-Slave Society in 1837 in New York City, Utica was represented by Martha W. Storrs, right there in the minutes. What's interesting is her husband, George Storrs, Reverend George Storrs, he was a traveling agent for the New York Anti-Slavery Society. And up here, there's a letter from his mother to him, and it's talking about she's hoping that there's no mobbing, because what would happen is there was a disagreement, and the people who disagreed with the idea of emancipation, would gather and they'd disrupt the talk. They would, get violent sometimes breaking windows and that sort of thing. But that did not deter Reverend Storrs nor his wife. She went on to go to the Anti-Slavery Society meeting in Philadelphia in 1838, and they went to a brand new hall that was built just for abolition meetings, and it didn't go as planned. It got burned down. First meeting ever used. The people of Philadelphia attacked it. They stopped the meeting. Everybody had to flee, and they burned down the building. Mrs. Sophia L. Fountain and Reverend James Fountain. They were early members of the multiracial Post Street community. James was born in Virginia. He arrived in Utica around 1826. He and his wife appear to have had 4 children. In the 1850 census, James lists his birthplace as Virginia, but after the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850 was passed, he changed his birthplace to Herkimer, because people felt there was a danger that in these documents, someone might be able to document the fact that they had been enslaved. And so a lot of people said, funny, weird, I grew up here in New York State all the time. And that's one of the reasons when you're going through, you can find who had been enslaved just because of this change in where they say they were born. For most of Fountain's life in Utica, he was a cordwainer, and that's somebody who makes new shoes from new leather. But there's this other passion driving him, and that's helping enslaved people who might be coming into Utica. And in his capacity as reverend and as an abolitionist and a supporter of these freedom seekers, he played a prominent part in an incident and an attempted rescue of an enslaved woman here. Fountain and others organized a kind of intervention to talk to a woman. The Gazette described her as he got a whole bunch of people together to go over to this house where a woman named Rena had been brought to Utica by her enslaver, John Munn. John Munn's going to come up later, too. So they brought this whole group of people over outside the house and wanted to speak to Rena, who was inside the house. Rena had been purchased with, right there, that's actually a deed for the acreage, 150 acres, and then Rena was just kind of thrown in there. Reverend Fountain asked to speak to Rena, and he wanted to let her know that in New York State she had the right to walk away, that because slavery had been abolished here, that she could not be enslaved here. John Munn apparently joined her at the door, and he announced that he was perfectly willing they should take the woman if they would give her security for her maintenance. This frightened Rena, who was 40, and she apparently had some illness called dropsy at the time. The next morning, Reverend Fountain had a chance to speak with Rena alone, although it was inside the house where they were staying, and he did not obtain her consent to leave her enslaver. So she practiced a certain amount of self-determination. If it may be that, if she'd been asked outside the house, but maybe not. I mean, she really did not want to go into an uncertain situation. And Reverend Fountain showed a willingness to step up into these situations if it meant the difference between freedom and slavery. Marionette Sherwood Savage was married to a Reverend Amos Savage. He was a pastor at the Second Presbyterian Church and later the Bleecker Street Church. He was a very early abolitionist who supported the founding meeting of the New York Anti-Slavery Society. So here is a wonderfully handy list of people from Utica and New York State who supported the founding meeting of the New York Anti-Slavery Society. I think it was published in Utica, but I haven't found that copy, so that was republished in the Liberator. And Reverend Amos Savage's name is on there. Marionette was part of the moral reform movement that I mentioned earlier, and she was very critical of this. In Utica, there was a lot of unmarried young men and young women who were coming in from more rural territory and getting jobs. And that was, you know, a recipe for, you know, sexual disaster. So she was very upright about that. In 1835, only 1 month after the founding meeting of the New York Anti-Slavery Society was disrupted by a mob, which forced 400 male delegates out of the church. It was reported that the brand new Utica Female Anti-Slavery Society had 77 members already. Now, most of those people were probably married to someone who had been involved in abolition here in Utica. And we haven't found the list, but I really would love to know. In August 1836, they'd gotten $12 together and they donated it to the New York State Abolition Group. By October 1836, there was also a female juvenile anti-slavery society. Now, I want you to take a look here. You see here it says Rochester female colored and Rochester female. So there's plenty of black women who wanted to be formally involved with local anti-slavery societies. In Boston and Philadelphia, there were multiracial groups. Those two societies in Boston and Philadelphia led the way, but there was a problem because whites sometimes didn't want to be working with black women. In some societies, there was a membership fee, and that made it harder for poor women, poor white women, and poor black women to join. Because of racism, the attitude of the white members might not have been friendly, you know. It might not have been a question of outright saying, no, you can't join, but there'd be slights. If every idea you had in a working group was just rejected, if your leadership capacity was undervalued, you might split off and form your own organizations. So we don't know exactly what happened in Utica, but there's a chance that there were things like that that happened, but maybe it didn't. Perhaps we should think it didn't. Little is known about Mrs. Jane Woodson and Mr. Tucker Woodson. She did sign a petition against enslavement in 1837, calling for Congress to eliminate slavery in Washington, D.C. A lot of these petitions thought that that was low-hanging fruit because D.C. might be able to just do it without it disrupting the rest of the slave system. Her husband, Tucker, was the embodiment of the Underground Railroad. He was an activist. He was known as an orator. He spoke at the Abolition Convention in 1843, as well as at local meetings in Utica. He was born in Frankfort, Kentucky, the son of a slaveholder, and when they asked him on this thing, what does your father do? Slaveholder. That's your job. Woodson was listed in 1855 as being mulatto or biracial. It's possible he escaped from enslavement. He lived in Utica before moving to Fulton in 1850. At age 54, he enlisted in the Army in the 184th Volunteer Infantry, and he was the only person of color listed on that page, and he was described as a barber. 22 days after enlisting, his unit was mustered into Company A, and on October 19, 1864, just 1 month after he came to serve, he was wounded in a battle at Cedar Creek. He survived. He stayed in the Army until he was mustered out at the end of the war in 1865 at City Point in Virginia. I just want to say that there's a lot more stories to learn out there. One of the challenges sometimes is even finding the first name of a woman. You got to find the marriage certificate because it's just, they're intensely making it private. So the research will continue. That's the last I have, but I'm sure that we're going to find a lot more. And Mary and I are trying to put together a book called Promiscuous Assemblies that's going to be about these local women. And the more that we can find, the better. So thank you. Mary's coming back up.
Okay, told Deirdre it's got to be real now. She told everybody here that we're going to do that, so it's going to happen. Okay. All right, I'm going to introduce you to a couple of really interesting families and one more really interesting woman. The first family I want to talk about are the Storhams, okay? We know Caroline Storham because she married a very famous abolitionist and they lived in Syracuse. But her family had always been very active on the Underground Railroad and anti-slavery activists. Her father, William Storham, moved to this area, Oneida County area, from Windsor, Connecticut, okay? He married a woman, Sarah Gomer Wills. Now, I'm gonna go off script here for just a minute here. Okay, this is what I think. I don't have all the documentation yet, but this is what I think, okay? Sarah Gomer Wills was married to Martin Wills of New Hartford. We've talked about the Wills family in New Hartford. It was an extensive family. Martin Wills died in Lake Superior. He was working up there. Sarah Gomer Wills then married William Storham, who is the mother of Caroline Storham, the woman we're talking about here. Sarah Caesar Wills, remember I talked about Frances and Sarah at the very beginning? She came from Bustine, New York. William Storham and Sarah Gomer Wills Storham, Caroline's mother, moved from New Hartford to Bustine, New York. You can't tell me these black families in that little town in western New York did not know each other. So I just got to find the documentation to make that connection. Okay, all right, I'll get back to what I was going to talk about now. All right, so along with European Americans, the African American Storham family moved to this area from western New England, okay? William's brother also moved here. Then he moved to Bustine. Then he moved to Pennsylvania, okay? So we've got the Storhams here in New Hartford, out in the western part of the state, in Bustine, that area, and across the border in Pennsylvania, okay? So keep that in mind. So this family, they were well-educated. Carolyn was a well-educated woman. She met and married Jermaine Logan, the very famous abolitionist I was talking about. He was a self-emancipated slave who came here. He went to school in Oneida County too, at the Oneida Institute. He met Caroline when she was visiting here from Bustine. They got married, ran a very open, active Underground Railroad station in Syracuse, where they lived throughout their lives. Jermaine Logan was an orator, he was a preacher, very well known. They even took an ad out in the papers that said, if you are escaping slavery and you're looking for a safe space, come to my house at this address in Syracuse. It took a lot of gumption. Okay, so we're here in Syracuse with the Logans. Okay. I found this quote in a book about women and transcendentalism, and it was talking about the Highgate's daughter. The Highgates were a family who were in the Albany area and moved here. African-American family, active in the abolition movement, okay? The dad was a barber, and they had a genteel boarding house in Albany. So they're kind of like, you know, middling, they call it middling class or middle class as they're making their way up. But I love this quote. It was in the Impartial Citizen back in the day. It says, "The Highgates engaged with local Black and anti-slavery communities and the region's nascent Black print culture. Hannah Highgate joined Caroline Logan, wife of Jermaine Logan, activist and future bishop of the African American Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, and Julia Garnett, wife of firebrand Henry Highland Garnett, African American activist as well, on a committee of women who planned an 1849 fundraising fair to aid Black activist Samuel Ringgold Ward's Reform newspaper." What I love about this is that it's a look into what these women were doing. Now, Logan and Garnett are big names in the abolition movement. They're here in Syracuse at the time. The Highlands move here. These women get together. They're working on this fair so that they can support another Black publication. I just thought that was, really an amazing little tidbit right there. So I brought in here too, Sarah's and Caroline and Jermaine Logan's daughter, Sarah. She graduated from Syracuse University with a medical degree. And when there was a description in the Negro History Bulletin of her credentials to go to medical school, it said she was educated in the public schools of the city, that would be Syracuse, and under the private instruction of her mother. So if you're teaching your kid and she's smart enough to go to medical school, you are doing a job. Okay, just a few more. I could go on forever, but I won't. So this one, Paulina Kellogg Wright Davis, she lived here 1833 to 1845. She was an abolitionist, an early abolitionist. She was very active in the women's suffrage movement. She was married to a man named Francis Wright. He was at that inaugural meeting of the New York State Anti-Slavery Society we talk about, the one that got mobbed, and they had to move to Peterborough. Their house was threatened by rioters that night. They were in the thick of it. I like to talk about her because along with her husband, she was a leader in these societies. She held a leadership role. She was on the executive committee of the Central New York Anti-Slavery Society. She published a women's newspaper later called Una, and she was really a strong women's rights activist throughout her life. Okay, I'm going to finish up with a family from Rome, okay? So Henrietta Bowen, she bought her freedom. She was enslaved in Maryland. She was the matriarch of the Bowen family. Her son Anthony also bought his freedom. Then he later saved up enough to buy the freedom of his first wife, a woman named Catherine. She passed away. They moved to Washington, D.C., not far, Maryland, D.C., and he, after several jobs, got a job at the patent office where he worked until he died, okay? Now, Henrietta had a daughter named Sally. Sally married a man named Alfred Stevenson. At the request of a well-known anti-slavery agent, activist, and Underground Railroad person, William Chapman, Sally, her husband Alfred Stevenson, and her mother, Henrietta Bowen, moved to Rome so that they would have someone on the canal to move people along, freedom seekers along, as on their way north into Canada. So it was a deliberate idea to make this part of the pathway. Okay, so one of the routes, Anthony's, down in the DC area, on the Potomac River. So he would meet freedom seekers, give them shelter, wait for a boat that could take them further along. And one route that we know was used was down the Potomac, up the Chesapeake Bay, through the Del Mar Canal, out to the Atlantic Ocean, and up to New York City. From New York City, they would get on a tow barge up the Hudson to Albany, which would then take them to the Erie Canal. Right? So Henrietta, her daughter Sarah, also called Sally, and Sally's husband sheltered them in their house on Bouck Street in Rome and helped organize their next stop in the route along to Canada. Here's a little footnote. In the Rome Sentinel article back in 2001, they were talking about a cemetery in Rome and some things that were happening there. And then amongst the people listed was Henrietta Bowen, a former slave, born in Maryland, died a free woman in Rome in 1860. So, there's a little picture of the Erie Canal, because why not look at the canal? That's kind of what it was like. Even though it's a more modern picture, it's still the basics. But here, all right, okay. No maps from the era, but Google Maps hit me up right here, okay? So, right here, where it says Erie Boulevard, that is where the canal was. And this dark blue street, that's Bouck Street. That's where Henrietta Bowen and Sally and Alfred Stevenson lived. And that's where they moved intentionally to make a spot for freedom seekers to come through and continue on up north. And those are some of the things that women and others did here in our county to put forth the idea of freedom for all people in this country. Thank you all for coming to hear us today.
Yeah, I thought
All right.
I thought if there's any questions, we just talked for a full hour, you know, so we really appreciate your hanging in there and paying attention and stuff like that. But we thought maybe if you had a few questions that we can answer, and those are the only ones we want you to ask. So raise your hand if you have any questions.
Mark's got a question.
What was the level of collaboration between black abolitionists and white abolitionists that made the Underground Railroad viable?
I think in some places it was high. Like in New York City, there was David Ruggles, who had been at the 1835 founding meeting of the New York Anti-Slavery Society, very active Underground Railroad conductor, and he had several white lawyers who were ready to go into court all the time. I mean, I think it varies much, but there are some examples that we know of where there was a lot of cooperation.
About in this area, this town?
There was cooperation, and we can look at, I'm looking over at Jan here because he's done a lot of this research. We know of freedom seekers who would come here to the area. They'd stop at one house, maybe Debro's or DeLong's. They'd move to Post Street where there were African-American Underground Railroad stations. Then they'd move, we have some who moved up through New Hartford and then on to the town of Paris, where they ended up living until they passed. So there was cooperation here as well. There was cooperation, people worked together, depending on the people, they would have meetings together, but there was still a lot of racism, especially among everyone, I would say. They would work together, they may not come to each other's house. There.
Yeah, I'm wondering if with Harry Bird and George, maybe that's one thing too, where you have two people who were hiding or who had blended into the Post Street community. And Post Street was these giant boarding houses that were filled with people. They had tiny rooms, but they, were something that people could afford. And they kind of blended in, these two guys who were from Virginia. But when a slave catcher from Virginia came up and grabbed them and brought them down to Judge Chester Hayden's office, Alvin Stewart, a white lawyer here in Utica, who's one of the founders of the movement here, he came and showed up and argued for these two guys, and then the black community came in and physically rescued them and took them away.
I just wondered, as far as buying their freedom, was that literal as an amount? Did that vary, or did?
Yes, it was literal, and it was not common. This is not something that most enslavers were not going to let their property leave. It was a big enough investment that over the years, it was worth a lot more than, say, the $200 or the $400 they would get. But yes, it did happen, and some enslavers were more willing to do that, but it was not common.
There's a good example with Samuel Dove and his wife, America Dove. They had to leave their boy Jesse in Mississippi when they were brought up by their enslaver, John Munn. And they decided that they wanted to buy him from enslavement, but it took them 10 years to gather the money. They had to mortgage a house that Samuel had built himself, and it was $1,500, which they knew was much more than the average sale. But they did buy him, and he came up and unfortunately lived for only 15 months and then died of a cold. But they're buried in Forest Hill Cemetery. There's markers there that were put on much later.
You talked about the movement and making communities in Paris. Are you familiar with some of the work that they've been doing in Florence?
Yeah.
It's great. As a matter of fact, Jessica, who is pushing that work forward, really the mover behind that and got the historical marker there, is a member of the Freedom Trail Commission along with myself, Deirdre, and Jan DeAmicis. Great work happening in Florence. Florence was a settlement of free blacks, some who were born free, who had self-emancipated, and it was financed by Garrett Smith. It was his land. Remember, his daughter invented the bloomers. She went to the school over there. And it lasted, about 10 years, 15 years? Yeah, until the Fugitive Slave Act really helped put a kibosh on that. But it's a wonderful community that was a strong support of emancipation and self-reliance.
Yeah. And Jessica's been working with people from New York State, archaeologists and that kind of thing, to try to find where all of the houses were. There's a very handy tax map that was found where she was able to put exact families into exact places. So there's going to be a lot more to come from that, I'm certain.
Yeah. All right, Jan. He said he's going to think of a question to trip us up, so let's see.
Well, I threatened you with a question, but I'm not going to ask a question. What I'm going to do is make two comments. First comment is, when you read the standard literature, the books on the Underground Railroad, you don't find this information. What you find here is exquisitely detailed and relentlessly pursued historical information by digging into the actual material of history, diaries, newspaper accounts, censuses, and reading between the lines and so forth. So what you see here is really an incredible feat of historical research. You don't get this information by going to the railroad. You've got to do it yourself. These are remarkable historians. And second of all, I don't know if you mentioned it, but that the Wills family, remember the house, the drawing, and then you had the picture of Paris Hill? That's where Mary lives.
Thank you, Jan. Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Yeah.
Thank you.